I have the daunting task of trying to convey some perspective on concepts to a room full of teachers and researchers and people who probably have already somewhat well-conceived notions of what you may or may not believe on these three concepts that we're going to look at this morning. Usually when you come into discussions of concepts in an academic setting, everybody gets their knickers in a twist. So if I see you squirming, I'll know what's happening. I want to start by giving you the lens through which I'm going to approach these three concepts, because the lens comes from more of my practitioner side than purely my academic side. And I consider myself a scholar practitioner, but if I'm really honest, I think I probably lean more toward the practitioner side than the scholarship side. I've placed some of the books that over the years have accumulated. You'll notice that they're extremely short and thin. My stack doesn't usually approximate the size of, in numbers of 3 or 4, that one of my colleagues' books may actually reach in a more formal scholarly publication. So I recognize that. So what you're going to get in part today is a view from the ground up, from the practice of this, and how that has informed my own personal transformation and how it is that I've come to understand these concepts and why I'm given to a certain way of working with them and presenting them. Now, to understand that, I need to take a small step back and give some of my personal background. I thought it was particularly useful yesterday actually to hear the panel, because I think it's instructive to hear where we come from. So yesterday in the panel, everybody said they had not come from peace studies. I happen to be somebody that has. So my trajectory traces back through my own faith tradition. Mennonites are among the what's sometimes referred to as the historic peace churches. I've been greatly influenced by Quaker colleagues alongside of that. By the time I was in high school, I was already deeply working with questions of nonviolence, resistance, conscientious objection. I was a conscientious objector at the end of the Vietnam War. Went to a community college. We called it a junior college back in the early 70s in central Kansas, a small Mennonite college. So those of you that teach in community colleges, I'm a product of community college. Yay, yay. And I took my first courses on ethics and peace studies. Not a program, but a course or two, because at that time you didn't have very many programs. You had a few spatterings of courses. I dropped out of school between my sophomore and junior year for about 5 years. I was an unusual sort of a trajectory in terms of that. But where I went was into international work. I learned 3 languages on top of English in that period of time. I was exposed to a whole variety of issues. I spent a lot of time with people from especially the Lake region of Africa who were studying in Europe, where I was mopping floors and doing my alternative service, serving meals. Late night chess games discussing the questions of revolution and change and whether violence could actually lead to that with people from what was then Zaire, Rwanda, Burundi. When the cycles of various forms of killings and genocides were happening in those regions, we had those expressions among the people that we lived with in the house. So for me, it was a university of a different sort. It was living with people who had quite different viewpoints. I say some of that because the background for me, when I eventually decided that I was going to pursue finishing my degree, I started hunting for peace studies programs. So it was in the mid-1970s. And mid-1970s, you couldn't find very many. There were, in the United States, I think there might have been 3 that offered some form of a major, or at least a combined minor that was pretty significant. And so I ended up, my undergraduate degree is in a major in peace studies and history. And so I am somebody who comes from out of this background. Just to give a sense that I not only am committed to this, but I believe very deeply that the kinds of things that you're working with and that you will offer to people is something that will and can make a very significant difference in who they will become and the ways that they will think about the world, whether or not they pursue it full-time professionally. I have never left this field. Most of my work from the 1970s forward has been in the area of peace building, and especially in arenas that involved conciliation, conflict response in a variety of ways. And so my exposures and background, as a way that I will frame what I'm about to try to present this morning, is mostly emergent from 2 or 3 sources. The first is that it comes from a faith perspective. That is, that I'm deeply committed that part of this is an expression of who I am and what I believe from my particular tradition. The second is that it comes from the perplexing and challenging and ongoing and never-ending question of what does this actually mean in people's lives on the ground, especially in contexts of deep-rooted and violent conflict that has lasted a long time. That's where most of my work has been, in places where there's been protracted and violent conflict. The third, I think, is the concern to reflect on what it is that one learns and experiences from this. So I consider this to be a small contribution, and Susan, I think, will go much deeper in terms of how this might connect at the level of classes and university courses. But I consider myself to be a reflective peace builder. That is, that I try to take the time to think about what the practice and the experiences and the unending challenges are actually suggesting. So almost across the board, my writings are inductive in nature. They tend to be emergent from things that I've been working with and trying to figure out what they may mean. So you're going to get a little dose of that this morning, and how it is that I had transformation in my own personal life that moved from one way that I had understood the word resolution into the ideas of conflict transformation and eventually into the notions of strategic peace building that accompany that. I'm going to start with 2 photos, which are up here on the wall. These are 2 photos. They're very similar, so I just click back and forth between them. This is from, we have one Nepali with us, I think. I don't know if there's more than one, but Madhav can raise his hand so he may recognize. Madhav has recently joined our Kroc Institute. He's working with what we refer to as the Peace Accord Matrix, which is a study of 30-some peace agreements over the last 20 years. This location is in western Nepal, in a region called Kanchanpur. I want to make just 1 or 2 observations before I begin about this photo and what you might see here. Then I'm going to go to my own personal journey with these concepts and come all the way back to these photos. Okay? So what you see here is a community gathering. This is not a traditional gathering. This is a new form, something new that's emergent for them. They are in a discussion, and these groups that are here, it's not easy to have the full panorama, but it makes a big semicircle. There may be as many as 80 to 100 people here today. By the afternoon, there were actually closer to 150. They have a dispute. There's a conflict in this community, and the conflict is over the use of the forest. Who should have access to it, who should use it, and what sort of ways that they will work with that. You'll notice there are a couple of people standing that appear to be maybe facilitating or guiding. I want to come back to that conversation. You'll notice there's a little bit of a format to this. Those of you that have a particular interest in these kinds of approaches, I'd be glad later to talk in much more detail about what we're working with on that side of it. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I want to ask 3 questions of these photos. Is this conflict resolution? Is this conflict transformation? Is this strategic peace building? Now, to answer those questions, I have to go back in time, and I have to retrace some steps to try to give you a kind of a range of both lenses and experiences. And then I want to come, hopefully, with adequate time that we can have a few questions and answers. I want to come back to answer those 3 questions and to try to illustrate what I think may be ways that you could envision those 3 things, not as polar opposites or contradictory, but as connected and complementary, but that require a certain way that we approach it that I think in particular makes special sense for the practice of this, even though conceptually it may leave us a bit messy. So this is where I'm going to start from. Now I'm going to go back in time, 1980s. I was coming out of a PhD program at the University of Colorado, and I had a request to develop a conflict resolution portfolio and training program in Central America. Now you may remember historically, the decade of the 1980s, Central America is a region of at least 3 open wars and a couple of countries that have a lot of brewing social conflict that has actually never quite stopped. My main countries of focus were Nicaragua, Guatemala, and a combination of Honduras and El Salvador. Guatemala, Salvador, and Nicaragua had open wars going. My counterparts were mostly people in the NGO world, primarily connected to a church base. And the request had come at the level that there was such a significant impact of the open, violent conflicts that people needed to develop some capacity to understand and think about how they would respond from where they were at in their localities, local people. And that those conflicts at a national level were often replicated within the communities where people were living, and in fact, within the churches that were supposed to be agents of constructive change. So I remember very well my first entry into this endeavor. I had done quite a bit of various forms of training in this. I had certainly a strong background in mediation. I've worked a lot as a mediator. To be very honest, most of my early mediation was in North America, was often based in community conflicts, but I had a lot of experience in probably the best training you could possibly get for dealing with violent conflict, and that was Mennonite congregational conflicts. I have always said that the best thing that prepared me to deal with Somali warlords in Mogadishu was the initiatives that I had to work through in congregational conflicts between pacifists. There's nothing worse in the world. So just so you have that as a background. When I first went down to Central America, there was a regional-wide gathering of the NGOs and the groups that were to be involved in some of these ideas. And I was asked to make a presentation about the basic notion of what this portfolio on conflict resolution would be. And without a second thought, I launched into a description about conflict, understanding it, mapping it, dealing with it, finding ways to bring forward creative solutions, etc. First response back. Sometimes your first responses, I had 2 or 3 of those from the Central American region in that period. This was one of them. First response back, what is this resolution thing? Because if you're coming down here to give another solution and quick fix, but not change anything, we've had enough of that already. That stuck. It stuck in such a way that it started for me a whole process of reformulation. Because the immediate response came at 2 levels. And both had something to do with experience and metaphor. First, there was an image. And the image that people heard when they heard the word resolution was the notion that somebody's going to give them a solution. But that solution won't change anything. And they've had a lot of that. People arranging things, taking care of things, finding solutions to problems, getting through a crisis. And the second piece of that was not changing anything meant there's a longer history, there's an experience. There's something going on here that's deeper, and that you can actually work creatively to solve a problem and not change anything. And they weren't interested in that. They were interested in what? Change. They wanted something more fundamental to change. But what? That became the exploration. Now, for me, that starting point is what I have found over and again at the level of thinking about what we are up to in this field, this endeavor, this work, these concepts. Now, personally, I think it's normative. So there are a variety of things that we could discuss around that, but I'm going to leave one of them this morning. And for me, the purpose of this field is to help nurture and develop, though we may never fully realize it, a concept that I would combine from my experiences of a small center in Colombia called Justa Paz. I would call it the seeking and the nurturing of just peace, linking the terms justice and peace. Now, this afternoon, we're going to run a little experiment with this with all of you, so you'll have a chance to explore it a bit more. But if you take the term just peace and you ask yourself how and in what ways might this be somewhat normative. By the way, I'm terribly old school. About 90% of my work in grassroots, they bring PowerPoint stuff and the electricity goes off for 14 hours and you're always going back to chalk or whatever. And I have never fully evolved into the world of PowerPoint. I was greatly encouraged, by the way, when I saw that enormous PowerPoint that the U.S. Army produced for their approach to Iraq, and where the commanding general said, the day we understand that PowerPoint is the day we'll understand what to do in Iraq. And that actually created a huge debate about whether PowerPoint is a form of dummying down things without having any capacity to understand where you're going. So I'll leave that for you to think about. It is only my justification for going to the old school approach. But if you combine justice and peace, among the things that you will find that I think are instrumental that we are after in this field is that we are trying to increase justice in human relationships. And we could subtitle those out. You're trying to increase access to resources, increase participation in decisions that affect your life, access to transparent information. There'd be a whole range of things that you could talk about that is about the increasing of justice in human relationships. And when you come to peace, among the things that has been significant in the field of peace studies, and which has increasingly taken over, by my view, not only an important part, but maybe the driving part, is how do we reduce the reliance on violence? How do we reduce violence? If not completely eliminate it. I mean, I think that's the long-term horizon that we seek to. So, increase justice and reduce violence in human relationships is a short way to capture the notion of a just peace. And here will begin a few of my inherent criticisms of the field itself and why it is that I have moved in certain ways to try to understand concepts a bit differently than at times they're put forward. I think that our field has been better at thinking about ways to reduce violence than it has been at thinking about ways to increase justice. And that if we are to combine these two things, essential at the very core of it is that it requires change. Go back to that early phrase. If you've come to give a solution but not change anything, we're not interested. So the core of this, for me, comes back to the question, how to keep a focus that what we are about is finding ways to develop and nurture and sustain processes of change. Now, I'm going to say something a bit radical. You can come back and comment on this. I always back away from my radicalness after I get good questions that sort of really raise the issue. But I would argue that solutions are temporary. Capacity to generate solutions is what you want to sustain. You want to work toward the generative capacity to be creative in innovating constantly responses to ongoing and dynamically changing situations. And at any given moment, a particular solution may in fact represent an interesting way, but within months, years, maybe a decade, there will be a need to come back and ask again, where are we? How are we? What is it that needs change? Now, where we have placed a lot of emphasis, I think, is the notion that we are in the business of developing and selling solutions. And I think that we're in the business of developing the platforms for constructive and generative change. Okay? Now, that's kind of a background. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to go to our terms. And I want to take them where my Central American colleagues pushed me. Where they pushed me was that terms are not something that are they're easily put on a page when you do an academic definition, but they also come with images. They come with metaphors. They come with ways that people perceive them and with ways that people use the metaphor to derive and create meaning. So I'd like to approach these terms less from the perspective of an academic definition and more from the perspective of metaphor as a starting point, image. Now, I've been greatly influenced in this. In fact, I've worked a lot with metaphors over the years. I actually think that most conflicts play themselves out in metaphoric narratives, and that what's often at conflict are ways in which people see the same thing but derive very different images and perspectives about what those things mean. And the way we construct meaning is often around that capacity to develop an image of what this means. So people will say, I heard what you said, and it meant this, and the other person will say, that is not what I meant. How did you possibly get there? Oh, I saw your eyebrow move. I heard the tone of your voice. I know your people. I know what you mean when you use that term. There's a whole range of things that come into the way meaning itself is constructed. And I think those are the elements, often at the subtext level, below the content, where 90% of this thing that we call conflict is actually often going on. So I'd like to approach these two terms initially, resolution and transformation, from a metaphoric perspective. Let me add one small note so that you can follow this as I go along, because I handed out 4 pages. And I want to draw your attention before I go further to the second page, which is a recent book, I think an excellent volume by our colleagues from, one or two is from England and one I think from Ireland, who have a book titled Contemporary Conflict Resolution. And it's a big, nice, thick volume. It's a very wonderful overview in a lot of ways of many things in the field. Students get a little daunted looking at it because you can't quite tell whether it's a platform for a high dive or a book that they have to read in one semester. So it's a big compilation of things. Early on in their volume, they say, we are cognizant that there is a debate. And there is a debate over terminology. We have chosen to stay with conflict resolution. They list people that have argued in directions of conflict transformation. I want to give you this because I think they have identified the 3 points that I most often hear when I talk conflict resolution. Point number 1, it's the term that started the field. So you have a journal of conflict resolution. George put it up in 1956. So if we have a journal that's called that, we surely should not move away from that term. Number 2, it's the term that is in the most use in the field. So they said as we surveyed the field itself, we noticed that most people still use this terminology. Number 3, it's the term most understood by the public, the media in particular. They raise a small point. Therefore, we choose to stay with conflict resolution. We see conflict transformation as a deeper expression of the same thing. Now, it's a very interesting discussion. I'm not going to go to that debate. I just wanted you to have in hand, because I think they frame it well. This is the debate. It's a very useful way to look at how we would understand terms. When I come to these two terms, I want to lift out, and this you can easily find on your sheet, a couple of ways that I envision the differences. I think metaphorically, the word resolution is built around the notion of seeking a solution. And as a paradigm, if you will, as a lens, what that draws your attention to is what's the problem and how do we solve it? Now, in the origins, if we go back to the 1950s and into the 60s, and the early use of the term conflict resolution, all the way up to 2007, I think when Contemporary Conflict Resolution was published, this bigger volume I just referenced, they will say that conflict resolution is to address the deep roots of the conflict and the needs that derive from understanding where it comes from. Now, I am fully in agreement with that understanding. My empirical evidence, if I have any, is that on the ground, in the field, in real-life situations, when concept hits practice, this is not what people do. Resolution has increasingly moved, I think, in more narrow ways. In the United States, this was greatly driven by what's called the alternative dispute resolution movement, out of which mediation, conciliation, arbitration, a wide variety of, and the word alternative basically meant alternative to a court, right? It increasingly narrowed toward ways that you handle disputes between people and find solution to those disputes. Now, I would make the case that part of what comes with this metaphor, the underpinning metaphor, is that it draws our attention to the question, what's the problem? What's the solution? It tends to be focused on more of a short-term trajectory. It comes into play at the point at which the conflict has emerged from something more latent into an open expression of conflict. It tends to focus primarily on de-escalation, whether that be de-escalation in an interpersonal relationship that's gotten out of hand, or whether it's de-escalation at a larger group level. It's about ways in which violence is reduced, if you will, but it's de-escalating conflict. It's trying to bring it, calm it down, and bring it to a way that dialogue can be more effective. It tends to focus primarily on the most visible expression and those involved in the conflict. So it would, if you're a mediator and there's a conflict in a school between two gangs, your focus would be how do we get these two gang members together? It may not be how do we change the whole of the community around why gangs are happening. It would be to say, this has turned into a nasty conflict. What resolution do we bring to this particular thing? So the focus tends to be ways in which the conflict is defined narrowly by those involved. So it's a narrower definition, by my view. Now I'm referring here primarily to what I notice over and again at the level of the practice. Right? Now, when I heard those words in Central America, if you're coming to give us a solution but not change anything, I actually had kind of a crisis, not only of conscience, but of complete vocation. Why? Because my life to that date, from virtually late high school into my early 30s, which is about the time period that I was doing this, that whole first decade, I was primarily involved in things that you would call social movements for change, nonviolence, civil rights. I was greatly impacted by the civil rights movement. My interest was the exact opposite of what they drew as their immediate image from that term. Simultaneous to this, I noticed increasingly that many of my colleagues, where I was gaining the skills of mediation, dialogue approaches, etc., which I think are absolutely marvelous, tended to have much more of a focus on skill. What's the skill necessary to do this? And almost, if you will, a mesmerizing view of the part of that is about the technique, but less and less a capacity to ask the question, how is what we are doing contributing to wider social change? And much less relevant as it went on in its expression, to the deep-rooted nature of protracted, violent, historic conflict of the kind that I was seeing in places like Central America, Colombia, Philippines, and on. So, second term, transformation. My sense of transformation is that its key focus is really one about change. So the lens that it brings is not what's the problem, what's the solution, but the lens that it brings is what kind of change does this conflict create and afford us an opportunity to think about in reference to a wider context. You know? So when your focus is on change, you are thinking both about a creative solution to the immediate problem, but you're looking at the immediate problem as a window into a wider set of things. And what are those wider set of things? Well, a lot of them have to do with pattern. What are the patterns that historically seem to generate this kind of situation? What's the history of this? I have a small thing I've noticed over the years. People who have been on the receiving end of a lot of violence have a long memory. People who have experienced very little of it have a very short memory. And so we who have experienced little would come quickly with problem-solving approaches to what appears to be the issue. But people who have been in it over and over through generations don't frame this as an immediate issue. They frame it as something that goes back 500 years. You can be in conversations in Bosnia. You can be in conversations in Northern Ireland. You can be in conversations in Colombia, where people will explain, I often ask this question, when do you think the conflict started? That's a very interesting discussion in any of these contexts, because they usually they walk through about four, and I put this in the moral imagination, the sort of ways that it embeds historically. The most immediate answer is often, well, 6 months ago in the election, so-and-so did something wrong and it created a fight and there was a whole range of things. But that actually has to do with, and they go back into a kind of a memory of their own lifetime, and then suddenly, without you noticing it, they're raising some things that you think they mean last year, and they actually mean 500 years ago. And it shocks you when you first understand that the point of reference that they've leaped from in a narrative of when and what was happening can move across that range of experience. This is, by the way, I think one of the things that we have in the United States in reference to how we understand our treatment historically of indigenous peoples, African American slavery. I think it has enormous amount to do with how our relationship, the West in general, and the Islamic world is understood, ways in which we see it as a contemporary question, and ways in which it's embedded in a much wider historical understanding. So I say this to make the case that part of what is required when change becomes the focus is not to be caught exclusively by the presenting issue or problem. That remains an important component. But I'm going to go back to my notion of window. We're sitting in a room that has no window, so I can't make my good illustration. I normally would say, look out that window. Look at that window. And what your eyes will do if you go to a window is you will never stop at the window. Your eyes will gravitate immediately to what's on the other side of the window. You have to intentionally stop for a moment to think about the pane of glass that is the window. Right? Now, my notion is conflict is an opportunity. Don't waste it. It's a window. When conflict emerges, especially in patterned historic settings, when it emerges up into an open expression of often violence or enormous energy around it, think about it as a window. You can stop your eyes at the problem and ask, what are they fighting about right now? But your eyes can also go right on through that and ask the question, what's the context of the histories, of the relationships that embed that particular problem as an expression of something that has pattern to it? And part of what happens with change is that you are looking at change in reference to the pattern, but you're also asking the question, how are we going to change in reference to the particular moment and the expression of this now? So by my view, I'm going to try to make the case that transformation is not choosing either or here, but that transformation provides a different lens through which you would look at it. It is inclusive of a resolution approach, but it is not defined in the narrow parameters that may come by looking for a shorter term resolution. This, of course, goes to a question of long term. So one of the things that transformation does is that some of the changes we're talking about are not changes that happen miraculously through a solution overnight. They have to come with time, preparation, and what I would refer to as platforms. Now, a platform for me, the way that I use that term, is that it is a basis, a capacity. It's primarily sets of people and how they relate and work together, but it is a basis from which it's possible to generate support for ongoing change and capacity to be creative in responding to the immediate crises that emerge. So a platform, to put it in these terms, is not crisis-driven. It's crisis-responsive. So it has a capacity to respond to the immediate issue at hand, but to do so in a way that thinks about, conceptualizes, visualizes other kinds of changes in a wider context that may be needed. This, in essence, is about an ongoing capacity. Now, here's where I'd like to do a little small drawing. Most of this you can find in the little book of conflict transformation, if you are interested in a description of it. Part of this came from my own experiences, especially at grassroots community level in settings of violence. I have to say I'm neither a big fan of, nor do I think it is empirically correct to use terms like post-conflict, post-violence. I think it may be accurate to say post-agreement. Most of the people that I live with have to live through repeated, reiterated cycles that are ongoing. You don't, while George showed us how much is being done in that corner around that, I think conceptually we have a lot to discuss about what metaphorically we're saying when we attach the word post to the word conflict, or we attach the word post to the word violence. Because what you might have is a reduction in open armed violence, but you rarely have a reduction in structural violence. So what are we taking up when we say we're in a post-conflict arena? Now, so here's my little drawing on that. My experience with change is that sometimes you feel like things are moving forward. Sometimes you feel like you hit a wall. Sometimes you feel like things have gone backwards. And sometimes you're going to feel like everything has fallen apart and you're starting over anew. These are four very common experiences in any change process of any significance at the level of issues that pertain to both structural and open violence. Now, the only way to know where you're at in a big picture is to have an expansive view of time. The more narrow your view of time, the more depressing this is. And the overly excited you get at these particular moments. So I have come, in fact, I wrote in one time that I've become a pessimist when everyone is optimistic, and I've become an optimist when everyone is pessimistic. And I have a long set of things that we could go into. I won't go into that here. So if you have an expansive view of time, you have to draw these circles over and over again. Now, obviously, what we're hoping for is that little by little it's moving this way, although in some contexts it may feel like it's moving this way. So we have to have an expansive understanding of where we're at and where we're located. Now, to understand the notion of platform to some degree and to combine these two terms of resolution and transformation, this I understand as the relational context within which things are happening. At a grassroots level, we usually can find a plant that describes this. A strawberry plant. In Nepal, we use the bamboo plant. These are plants that shoot up and have a significant root system. So that we're not too far from the academe, we do talk about root causes. We have a metaphor that we refer to this by, root causes of conflict. But actually, it's very instructive to look carefully at how the ecology of this emerges. I don't know if any of you have ever grown raspberries, but I had raspberries for a while. I thought they were a fantastic plant until I discovered what they actually do. You know, because you put them in a place and pretty soon they're showing up in a lot of other places. Underneath the ground, they're sending, the Spanish would call them children. They're sending their roots, and they pop up pretty much where they would like. In other words, the generative capacity is here. The visible side of it is. So in sort of rough terms, we could say this is the content of the conflict that's more visible. What are we fighting about now? Let's fight over land, salary, time, any range of things that we could think about. And what's the root of this? And I think a lot of the roots have to do with things that we have to think more carefully about, and that the resolution techniques are more focused here than here. And those tend to be, by my view, power, which is deeply embedded in relationship. Power has a lot to do with participation and decision making. Who has access to that? How is it used? It has to do with a big issue around identity. I think one of the biggest questions that get asked at the level of conflict of the relational context are the hardest ones to actually surface. Who are you? Who am I? And who are we? This I learned in congregations. Okay, so you want to see this in a congregation? I don't know if any of you ever have approached a Mennonite congregation, so I'll give you our examples. You want to bring in a new hymn book? Oh my God. That hymn book is going to change who we are. Okay? So the content is a huge fight over the hymn book, right? The relational context is about who are we? You want to put a new Sunday school wing on the church? Same thing. Escalade once did a mediation on an escalator. It was supposed to be for disabled people, but an escalator caused the church split. Mostly Mennonites expand not by conversion, we expand by split. We are amoebic-like in our efforts in the world. So we have a tremendous capacity to get all in a tiff over the content, when actually a lot of what's happening is about these deep identity issues. How is this instructive of who we are? Now, when we take this and place it here, part of what I'm after is an image that looks something like this. So you have to bear with me on my picture. That out of the relational context, there is a capacity to generate enormous energy over particular issues at a given moment in time. And a lot of the energy and focus will go onto that particular issue and what to do about it. And if your resolution model is more narrow, you will focus on a solution to that issue or set of issues. But you may find that you have a solution, but not a change in the wider patterns that generate it. So transformation for me is both a capacity to think creatively about the immediate presenting issues, but also an ability to ask the question, what changes are needing to be engaged at the level of our relationships? And these often have to do with power, identity, perception, a sense of who we are in the history of this. Now, so this is ongoing. And this tends to have more temporary boundaries to it. That would be one way to look at the significance. Now, just put the word transformation. By my view, transformation requires you to both think creatively about solution, but it also requires you to think more creatively about the context within which it happens. Paula, you have a quick question on this?
Yeah. You're using the word transformation and change in a valued way or not valued way?
Yeah.
Where I'm getting stuck in getting this is I'm getting the sense that you're attaching a normative value to transformation and change
Yeah.
as they are good. Transformation is by whom, for whom.
Yeah.
Change by whom, for whom.
Yeah.
That's where I'm getting lost.
Well, this could actually lead to about 3 more lectures, but let me try a very short way. One way that I've come at this is that one side of this is descriptive. So it's less normative. And I actually think that here is where I was greatly impacted by my own training in sociology. Now, from sociology, you go to Coleman, you go to Kozer, you go to a range of people. They will say conflict actually makes impact. It changes things. Marx. So you have a range of people that were sociologists that make this argument. And they will identify ways in which conflict changes things. One of the ways that I've worked with that is that I think it changes people as individuals. It changes relationships. It changes structures. And it actually has, at the deepest level, components by which it begins to impact culture, patterns that have a really deep level. This descriptive side is less normative. It's not saying that it should do this way or that way. Marx, for example, would say, let's generate conflict to shift the way capitalism functions in people's lives. So he would have said, this conflict is a motor of change, let's use it. Right? That would be Martin Luther King or Gandhi would have said the same thing. They would say it has capacity, it will impact things. Prescriptively, one of the cases that I would make on this is that all of us should engage in the process of identifying what we believe, what we're about. What kind of change are we encouraging or discouraging at the level of person, relationship, structure, etc. And in the book, actually, I lay out my own on that. You could see to what degree you would agree or disagree. But I think that what's incumbent from a peace studies viewpoint is to understand the dynamics descriptively and to have clarity about one's own purpose, with whom, for what, etc. So when I laid out just peace, in part I was saying, part of what I'm interested in conflict is to increase justice in human relationships and to decrease violence. Not everyone would share that. There may be others that would see it in a very, very different way. But I think it's incumbent on us to do that hard work, to say where we are and who we are and how we're going to see it in the world. So, now, I'm going to run out of time, so let me go to one or two of the questions that I have not addressed, which is around the word strategic. And here, strategic came in particular for me, around the concept of peace building. And while we have a recent volume, and I placed some of the books out on the table for your perusal, they actually are mostly from Katie Mansfield's desk, so if you steal them, they're hers, not mine. But please leave them on the desk to be recuperated at a later point. One of the books is the recent volume from the Kroc Institute on Strategies for Peace, where we're making a case for strategic peace building. That just came out a few months ago. And in that particular context, we've looked at a range of ways that peace building needs to broaden its way of operating and way of being thought about. Some 10 to 15 years earlier, going back to my practice side, for me, this was a push that was given primarily to the NGO world. In the Kroc book, we're looking at policy, we're looking at a whole range of things that include a practitioner NGO world, but much broader. For me, what I found over and again is that we had a lot of very well-intended people doing very good work locally that had no real capacity to think strategically. That is that among other things, a kind of a three-tier approach that I worked with at one point about high-level negotiations, mid-level actors, and grassroots communities, each having different approaches to peace in a given context. This one very much top-down, this one very much bottom-up, this one more of what I refer to now as a web approach. That people at this level were often doing very good work locally, but they had no notion by which that locally translated into something that was transformational at a wider social level. So I refer to it not as bottom-up, but as bottom-bottom. A lot of good work that never went beyond the expanses of a particular application locally. And by my view, a lot of this was driven by a project mentality, a shorter-term view of how funding happens. And I think one of my big ongoing discussions with people is the debate around agency. And I think our agency is defined primarily by the economics of agency. That comes a lot from both government agencies, and it comes also from funding agencies. And the ways in which they conceptualize change is in projects. Now, one of my arguments will be, in terms of being strategic, is be time expansive. I don't think you can actually talk about change in anything less than decades. But most of us want to do it in modalities that are much shorter. And so we're essentially bringing in good literature. We become fiction writers. We write fiction when we write proposals and grants. We say we're going to do these changes, and we're going to accomplish them in this time. And then when the time comes for assessment, we say, and here is our report about the new chapter on the evolution of our fiction, how it is that it has evolved, and why we didn't get that fully accomplished. And I think really, for me, one of the ways that you get to be strategic is that you start thinking at a minimum in blocks of 10 years for most significant social change. And that's probably even way short. But that would be a huge shift from a 1 to 2 year project mentality. A second way is that you start to expand who you're with. In Spanish, they say, if you show up and you're always with the same 4 cats, cuatro gatos. If you're with the same 4 cats, you are in trouble in terms of social change. That is, I think here's one of the big critiques of the peace movement. The peace movement, by and large, has thought the way we expand is we get more people who think like we do to join our ranks. And so we keep trying to bring in people. But what we haven't done is had the courage to be in relationship with people who don't think like us, don't view the world like us, and are not situated like us. I mean, one of the hardest things to do is to create any kind of relationship between the highest level and the grassroots. This is the biggest gap, the vertical gap, I would call it. Okay? So a second way to be strategic is around the who question. Who are you with? And if you're only with people that think like you might think about expanding your network. Because you probably have good ideas that won't go very far. A third way, we have to think creatively about where to place a focus on issues. Too often, I think we get driven by whatever the crisis is producing. And we don't have a capacity to identify and locate the things that have long-term strategic importance that if we placed energy into it, in spite of the ups and downs, could make a difference. George, I forgot to ask, how long does this session go? Is it till 10 or 10:30? 10:30. Okay, so I'm going to move, so we give 15 minutes for discussion. I'm going to move now for a moment back to this photo, show a few things about it that I think may be helpful to situate it, and then open up for your questions, because you may well have comments to add to this or things you want to push on. So I want to go back to my questions. Is this conflict resolution? Is this conflict transformation? Is this strategic peace building? I'm going to answer yes, yes, and yes. With the final yes being, it still has a long ways to go. All right? So yes number 1. This is a group of people gathering to discuss a conflict in their community. So I'm going to describe who they are now so you have a little better sense of it. Located around this circle, you'll see a little set of benches. Sometimes they bring out their beds function sometimes as a sitting thing. So that bed is called a cot. So we call this the cot approach, because you can sit 3 or 4 people on a cot when you're discussing, and at night it goes in, it's a bed. So each one of those represents a different group. What are the groups in this conflict? Well, here, this largest group right here is a group of landless people. They've been displaced primarily by the war. There is a group to the left that are bonded slaves. It's a phenomena in parts of the India-Nepal border where there was bonded laborers who fell into a form of slavery over generations. Some efforts to eliminate that has often sent those people out from where they've been for generations, but then they have to find a place to live. So they migrate, they move. And where they move to is often toward the forests, because they use almost, in very large percentages in Nepal, they use wood as a way to generate cooking and other things. So this is often where they look. So there's a group of bonded slaves. There's a group over here that are representative of several of the other community groups. Among them, the forest user group. Now, the forest user group, I'm going to explain in a few minutes, is a membership group in which a local community has members who come together and form a group that conserves and regulates the use of the forest for the community. Now, the forest user group views the landless and views the bonded laborers as encroachers. In other words, we have a group that has been regulating this, and these people showed up and occupied and started using a portion of the forest, and that's created this particular conflict. Okay? Who are the people that are standing here? The two that you see are actually members of a group of 8 or 10. You can't see all of them. They are from these groups. So the young man standing there is a bonded laborer, bonded slave. And the young woman is a member of FICO Fund. She comes from a Dalit group, the Untouchables. So they have other members. There are 2 that will be taking notes and preparing things for the group. There are about 6 that are called mobile. They're moving around the outside of the group. All of them are from the community that has this conflict. As individuals, each of them is actually linked to one of the groups. But they form a little team that provides the development of the process and the facilitation of the discussion. So these are not outside facilitators, nor are they professional. The entire evolution of this was, to some degree, to develop a capacity for the community itself to lift up this process. Now, how is this conflict resolution? Well, they are going to talk about and try to find an answer to the question of what to do with that particular issue around where the landless and the bonded slaves have arrived in their forest and how it will be used. It will take probably 3 or 4 sessions. The first session will simply be a process of hearing and airing out what it is that each side sees. Second session will be airing out their proposals. And a third eventually will be to see what they decide to do with it. So there is a component of this that is very conflict resolution-like. At some point, they're going to have a decision about what to do with this issue. Is it conflict transformation? It's an interesting question. The level of conflict transformation, the group that is facilitating is developing a whole range of changes in the ways that they think about their communities, their role, and their approach. The things that they have identified, this comes back to Paula's question, the things that they have identified that they wanted to work on in terms of change really had 4 or 5 elements. The first was that almost always when there were conflicts at the local community in these rural areas, there was often a dependence on somebody bigger, stronger, or more powerful to join one side against the other. Now that could come in the form of somebody who was more wealthy that was actually sometimes promoting a landless group because he wanted, as an example, to produce cardamom in part of the forest, and that if they were occupied there, there would be ways in which that could be done. It could come in the form of politicians. Politics is always, in Nepal at a local level, can be very quickly tied up into some divisive differences. Sometimes it was caste-driven, of who might be a more powerful deciding person at a caste level. So, but the thing that they were interested in was, is it possible for we as a community to develop our own process, to make our own decision, and not depend on the traditional ways that have tended to exacerbate our local conflicts? That was one change. The second change, how to be more inclusive. Now this lies actually at the fore of some of the membership groups, but it also was very much a part of this particular process. Their sense was almost always in these conflicts that they replicated patterns of exclusion. And primarily those went in 2 directions. The first form of exclusion tended to be women. That is, that women were often at a much lower level of participation and direct action. There was a lot of concern about how to do that. And I'll say a word about the group called FICO Fund, the Forest User Group, in a minute. But the second was that exclusion also went in the direction of caste differentiation, lower to higher. And the third was that in a lot of these areas you have phenomena like landless groups and or bonded laborers and displaced people from the war, many of whom are at the lowest echelons of economic poverty or simply trying to find ways to survive. Now, the model that they're trying to work on is one that takes longer to get to, but is highly inclusive. Now, it's not easy to imagine in the history of this particular location that the two primary visible facilitators would be a young Dalit woman and a former bonded laborer. But these are two people, so you can actually see part of the change that they're after in terms of questions of exclusion. The third element, and I won't go to all of them, but the third one I think is also very critical, had to do with community empowerment. That is that the power structures politically in Nepal have placed enormous centralization in the Kathmandu Valley and into the political structures that lead back to the capital city. This is not uncommon to a lot of locations. Here, for years, many things have been put on hold in local communities. Yet local communities were highly impacted by the levels of violence and things that were happening. So how do communities begin to find the spaces where they think they can make a difference without having to replicate the sort of longer-term patterns that excluded local rural communities because they were not a part of the national ethos? The final one, which is a very interesting one and one that doesn't come easy, is that the two patterns identified in most of these conflicts, especially coming out of a 10-year civil war, was that confrontation became a primary modality. So confrontation often led quickly to violence in these local areas. And violence would repeat itself, even though it may not have been a direct armed violence, it could very easily repeat itself. So you had two patterns. One was the confrontation leading to violence or avoidance, and very much in kind of a total win-lose modality. And part of what this approach is attempting to do is to say, we would like to change, to move from confrontation that increasingly is destructive, to find ways in which confrontation can happen through engaged dialogue. Now that's a shift, it's something thereafter. The platform is where I think we begin to open up the question, is it strategic? So is this strategic peace building? Now, just to give a small piece of this puzzle that I have a 10-year commitment to work with a set of people in Nepal. It includes this on natural resource conflicts, it includes local village level mediation, and it includes women's empowerment. And a fourth one that got added to that is that I work at a very high level political level. So every time I go, I meet with a range of politicians who are always bickering, and I meet with grassroots communities, and I sometimes feel like Alice in Wonderland. You don't know if you're in the same country when you move from these different levels. So this is actually a process that's in its 7th year. That's what doesn't show up in the picture. And when I say make a commitment, these things do not happen because overnight somebody brings a proposal or a course or a curriculum. They happen because there's a long process. Part of it involved several years of participatory action research. In other words, the people who are involved in this facilitation were also involved in researching how do the conflicts happen? What are the dynamics that are there? What are the things we want to change? How does it actually work if we try this? You proposed that, it didn't work. What else are we going to try? So you had this constant learning modality that was a part of getting to this location. Strategic who and strategic what? Strategic who? The people that we're working with, there are two member organizations around natural resources in Nepal. One is called FECOFUN, the Forest Users Group. They started 15 years ago with 12 people and two principles. Principle number one, forest user groups will form locally. People become members of a local user group. So everybody who's a member is connected in some locality. Principle number 2, no group can form unless they're half men and half women. There is no other organization in Nepal that has that fundamental principle, half men and half women. Today, they have over 8 million members, more than something like 18,000 user groups. It is one of the most extraordinary sort of active but not that visible networks that are about very concrete survival questions. Forests are survival for a lot of these people in local areas. This means that this organization has, at the adult population level, about 1/3 of the population of Nepal in some form or another connected. And they stand almost on par with the Ministry of Forestry. They're constant negotiation over a local forest user group having a boundary given, or whether it's turned over to Nepal. So in terms, the second group that's a part of this is NIFWAN. That's the Irrigation and Water Users Group. The irrigation and water users, if you want to look at it generally, a lot of the water use is around irrigation areas. That's more in the Tarai region. That's the flat area going into India. A lot of the forest areas move from the flat areas upwards into the hilly areas and sometimes the high hills. So you have, with these two groups, they have about 2.5 million members. So you have your strategic who. We have 30 to roughly 40 people who over the last 3 or 4 years have been working at this approach. And over the next 3 years, by the time the 10-year completion of accompanying this particular foundation's effort will come, they will have hopefully found the modalities that they then begin to replicate through their organization. So there's a strategic component of this is to not just think about the particular disputes and how you resolve them and what techniques you propose, but how do you embed this in networks that have life and livelihood attached to them. So it's not something foreign to a particular thing. As a professional elite that stands on the outside, it's embedded in the very things that make it necessary. Strategic what? Long term in Nepal, while the war may continue in one form or another if they can't get through the current peace process, the greatest likelihood is that conflicts in the next 20 to 100 years are going to be primarily over natural resources. Land, use of forest, and water. And in Nepal, water is going to be huge. So when I say strategic but, I think this is an effort to increase the capacity of local communities to engage ways in which they're participant and can move vertically. That is, that they can speak in ways that begin to have impact beyond their communities. But I think the biggest strategy questions is actually probably around water. If you want to see the really big picture in Nepal, it looks like a little rectangular box. It's landlocked. It's between who? China and India, two very powerful nations. The water flows from the Himalayas, so it flows from the China border to the India border, with one exception. There's one border where there's a bit of, certainly India comes across. There are very significant rivers. It's probably Nepal's greatest natural resource. When you're in Nepal, you have 14 to 16 hours with no electricity. So it gives you some idea of the issues that are floating around production of electricity, hydro plants. Most of that comes from capital outside. How and in what ways will the rivers be used? Who will benefit from them? And this, I think, has numerous levels. One would be, as they begin to talk about federalism in Nepal, almost all the federalist models that they have are divided by some form of geography and ethnicity that don't take into account the rivers. So the rivers are going to cut through what will probably become the new federalist components. You can imagine that there will be enormous conflicts around the use of this. And at a much bigger picture, water may be one of the interesting strategic what's, the magnet that might bring people together. If you wanted to start something interesting and different between China and India in what is a rising level of potential conflict at a very significant impact, it might be to find things like water around which you would carve an ability to think about collaborative understandings long term, as opposed to the narrowness of who's going to benefit from it and how it will be used. So it's a strategic approach, but one could say it constantly grow in that reference. So now I've given you an awful lot here. I'm going to open up for about 5 or 10 minutes to see what things you would like to push out on, or to take a contrary view. George invited you early on to make sure not to miss the chance to push me in a corner, so please do. Penny.
I have so many questions. One, I see your hand in this. Beautifully done, where you called. Do people call you and say, come here and work with us? And then two, because you work in Colombia too, and I know that in Colombia and Brazil, those are two countries I know about, you have these kind of groups, but there are paramilitares paid by the landowners and by the government who are harassing and killing these people, which is an added terrible stress on the whole system.
I won't go immediately to Colombia on this right now, but let me invite you to talk to Maria Lucia or Rosa or Jimena about some of those very issues, because they've been working with that in particular on the Caribbean coast. On this particular one, the short answer is this was by far the most unusual invitation I've ever had. And it was unusual in 2 or 3 key points, so I'll try to mention them as quickly as I can. The first was that the foundation that is behind this is located in Redding, California. It's a very small foundation called the McConnell Foundation. They only do funding in 2 counties around Mount Shasta. And they have one international project. And the one international initiative was that they had decided in the late 1990s to locate a country that had some parallel to their rural area of California. And so they ended up working primarily in things around agriculture and water issues and some women's issues in the very remote parts of Nepal. And most of their work got impacted when the Civil War began to really explode, and a lot of the things that they were involved in were no longer able to move forward. Unexpectedly, the person who was one of their key partners was a person who was linked to a small team of Nepalis who was quietly moving between the Maoist leadership, this is the Maoist insurgency, the political parties who at the time were kicked out of parliament by the king, and the palace. And that, so to answer your question on request, this fellow called one day and said, I don't think we can continue our agricultural work if we don't figure out a way to deal with the war, because it was just impossible. And we have tried twice to hold negotiations. They failed. We need help. Who can you get a hold of? Karen Bennett, who's from the foundation, goes to a bookshelf. This shows you the importance of books. It wasn't mine, by the way. It was the only book she had at the foundation on this issue, which was Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher and Bill Urey. She turned the book on the backside and saw 2 pictures, and she said to herself, Roger Fisher's too old to survive a trip to Nepal. Bill Urey looks a bit younger. She calls Harvard, and Harvard says, no, Bill is out, and Bill lives actually very close to where we have a home in Colorado. And within a day, Bill and I were on the phone with Karen, who was in California, and Duman, who was in Nepal. And the conversation was very simple. They said, we're really not calling to do more than to ask if we came to see you, could you give us a day? We checked calendars. We said it was a Tuesday. We said the only time we were going to be there together was that weekend. They flew, Duman from Nepal came in from California. We sat for a day and a half. In that conversation, Bill Urey, who many of you know from Getting to Yes, is more known for his work on this side of the puzzle. He wrote a book called The Third Side, which moves to this side of the puzzle. And he's an anthropologist. So at his core, he doesn't come so much out of a law school as he does out of a different sort of an avenue. Our combined proposals, among other things, was multiple tracks of activity, but also at a minimum of 10-year commitment. Karen took that to her board. In 2 months, a board of exclusively, I should be careful because all this is being recorded and they probably wouldn't want it to bounce back, but they're Republicans. They're conservative, rural Californian Republicans, voted to approve a 10-year budget for peacebuilding in Nepal. So it was the first and only foundation that I've ever had take me serious when I said, you have to think in 10 years. She called and said, we won't do this unless you agree to accompany us. And I said, oh my God, now what am I going to do? And so it started there. We're in our 7th year now. So it takes a long time to get to some of what you see here and to land on what seemed to be the strategic things to place emphasis on. I mean, they're really in those 3 areas that we that we work with. Nina.
I very much appreciate the model you have at Lab, and I hope to learn more about this. My main concern is when you are willing to go beyond the evident in terms of a conflict and go into gender injustice, socioeconomic injustice, it would be so easy to be overwhelmed. And how can you ever tell that you're progressing? Because I imagine that these issues go way beyond this community, and therefore in Nepal, as in my own country, and most of Latin America, things have changed superficially, but really there hasn't been much change.
Yeah.
In Central America, the wars are over.
Yeah.
Has there really been change?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Well, it's a great question. This is where we come to the challenge of measurables. And I think we do a disservice when our primary measurables are things that are immediate, that we're trying to locate specific things that are better suited to be seen with some level of longitude. Most of these movements, a movement like FECOFUN, for example, you wouldn't have been able to do almost any kind of measurable in its first 6 or 8 years. But when you start looking back across 15 and 20, you notice how what they've done is beginning to have a different kind of an impact. And I think so part of it has to do with time horizon when you're asking the question of change. I think one of the reasons why we tend to gravitate toward the resolution model in the way I've been depicting it, that is that the practice of it is often focused on the more immediate issues, is that it's hard to find the ways to engage the other levels unless you come at it with a different paradigm. Now, my own view is that these are primarily approaches and techniques, not exclusively, but primarily, and that this is a paradigm. In other words, a paradigm is a way that you're looking at an overall question within which you have tools and other things that you may draw on. And I think one of the mistakes we make is that we think mediation is a paradigm. I think mediation is a useful but has a huge variety of applications and ways of doing it, and it's far too narrow to use it as paradigmatic in a certain way. If anything, I've made a case you could think about mediative spaces, ways in which you embed a way of thinking about it. So like with this group, we didn't do any mediation training. We spent an entire week on how to think like a mediator, how to think like a facilitator, because they have very powerful skills in what essentially is the arena of protest and nonviolent confrontation. They don't need a lot of bolstering on that side. What they needed more was how and in what ways do we engage a community-wide dialogue when we're a part of the conflict. That was the challenge, when we're a part of it. And we're not going to expect any professionals to arrive from outside. So how do we approach that? That became the sort of, now that's the kind of thing that comes from, by my view, a transformative lens that's asking about change, as opposed to what's the problem and how do we find a solution that narrows in on a particular moment.
Not just Israeli-Palestinian, but of course the growth of the desert in northern Africa, and the conflict of Turkey and Syria, and
Absolutely.
so on with water.
Yeah.
Water more precious than oil.
Yeah.
Now, how do you see transformation when you have a declining resource and growing populations? How do you do transformational change?
Yeah. With a great deal of creativity. I don't know, in other words, I don't think that there is a, quotes, recipe that would come at a solution side to this. If a recipe exists in my mind, it has to do with the strategic who that links to a strategic what. So in this case, water, but the who question becomes one of constant exploration and learning. Now, the parameters that I see are basically these. You can have a brilliant idea about what to do on a water issue in Turkey or in Palestine, Israel. And if you don't have the right people connected in the right way, it will collapse. On the other hand, if you can find a way to innovatively bring together an improbable set of people Who they are, I don't know. This is part of the constant discovery. But if you get the right set of people, even if you do not have an idea, it will emerge from what comes out of that space and context. So in fact, one of the basic things we've worked with in this model is that the impulse to move quickly to a solution to the problem often gets in the way of the careful work that has to be done to find the right set of people, strategic people. There are several metaphors by which this is referred to in this picture you see here. One is the notion of a spider who carefully sees the strategic points in a space, and that a lot of the thinking that has to be done is spatial. Who are the strategic groups? How do we link to them? What are the entry points, et cetera? Another metaphor that they brought forward was one of their national soup. Their national soup is called Kwati, spelled K-W-A-A-T-I. And so this came up in a big debate that we had over whether it was possible for me as an activist in one group, bonded laborer, for example, or an activist in FECOFUN, to also be a facilitator. Can I be an activist and be a part of a team that's helping people, talk? This was a huge debate that we had. And their metaphor for it in the end was Kwati soup. Kwati soup is a 9-bean soup. And each bean has to be fermented in a certain way. Each bean retains its flavor, but when it comes in the soup, it creates something of a bigger whole. So the notion that they brought to it was that each retains its flavor, but in the combination has a capacity to contribute something for the good of the whole. And that was a notion that they began to have of leadership. That leadership was about how I'm clear with the group I'm in, but how I'm also able to provide a different kind of leadership for the whole of the community and not exclusively my group. Now this comes back to the strategic. So Israel, Palestine, Turkey, we put any of them. I don't have a clear sense of what would be needed. I have a clear sense of the challenge of finding interesting and improbable sets of people. I would have proposed the same for Nepal. I think it would be very interesting to try to think about round tables built on rivers, rather than round tables built on, quotes, those who are specialists in water areas, if you will.
Because the impetus is on exclusion.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what they're
point.
all about,
Yeah.
excluding others.
So it would be a challenge. Now, we are past our time, so I probably should call this to an end. I'm happy to go to break with people and follow it on. So, George,
Yeah, because we do have a coffee break until about 11, so some people can isolate John Paul over coffee. Let me say one quick pedagogical insight derived, at least by little old me, from what John Paul said. I had 2 different conversations with teams yesterday, one a quickie and spontaneous and another a little bit more programmed, about one of the great difficulties as we think about our program is, you need such specialized people in conflict resolution, mediation, negotiation, et cetera, et cetera. While we warned you the first night about don't get bit by all the bugs, this is an interesting bug. You can do conflict resolution in your program development if you don't tie yourself to the very strict left-hand side that says, well, you got to have a textbook on mediation, you got to have a textbook on negotiation, and you need a specialist with long training to be able to do that. There may be a sociologist, a psychologist, an anthropologist in your midst on your campus who very much deals with processes of social change in what they do, but they may know nothing about this model. They may know nothing about this approach, which is why we're going to say some things tonight at Campfire about faculty development. But so there may be some pedagogical implications in addition to all the other good things John Paul has brought us this morning. Thank you very much. We're on break until 11.